The clatter of silverware froze. A thick, suffocating silence descended upon the opulent dining room of Onyx, a space usually filled with the confident murmur of New York's elite. Claire's arm was caught in a vice-like grip, her manager's fingers digging into her skin. In front of them, a senator's son, his face flushed with wine and entitlement, pointed a trembling finger at a dark stain on his tailored suit. His voice, a venomous fleur, echoed off the marble floors, accusing her of a clumsiness she did not commit. Every eye in the room was on her, a jury of indifferent, judgmental stares. She felt their contempt like a physical blow, a wave of shame that threatened to drown the quiet dignity she fought so hard to maintain. He was dragging her, pulling her toward the grand entrance like a piece of trash to be discarded. But what happened in that room would change her life forever, and if you watch until the end, you will discover the devastating secret he saw in her eyes. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This is a story about the moment when a forgotten woman is finally seen, and the terrifying price that comes with it. Claire, at 28, had mastered the art of being invisible. As a waitress at Onyx, her existence was a series of silent, efficient movements, refilling water glasses before they were empty, clearing plates with ghost-like swiftness, and offering a tired but resolute smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was a fixture in a world of transient power, a backdrop to conversations about mergers, politics, and inheritances. She moved with a grace born not of training, but of a desperate need to remain unnoticed. Her strength was quiet, a steel spine hidden beneath a starched uniform. She had learned long ago that in a city built on noise and influence, silence was her only shield, her integrity the only thing she truly owned. Her world was a stark contrast to the gilded cage where she worked. It was a fifth-floor walk-up in a neighborhood the city had forgotten, an apartment where the silence was a companion, not a choice. Her life was a relentless cycle of double shifts, the scent of expensive food clinging to her clothes as she rode the late-night subway home. The pressure was a constant, dull ache in her chest, the weight of her mother's medical bills, the student loans from a degree she never got to use, and the gnawing fear that one misstep could send her entire fragile world crumbling. She dreamed of a day when she wouldn't have to choose between fixing a leaking faucet and buying groceries, a simple freedom that felt as distant as the stars. This resilience was forged in the fire of an earlier loss, a profound injustice that had stolen her youth and left behind a hollow space in her heart. Her father, a man of unwavering principles, had been ruined by the very kind of powerful, careless men she now served every night. She carried his memory like a secret vow, a promise to never bend her own moral code, no matter the cost. This quiet grief fueled her empathy, but it also built a wall around her, a solitary fortress where she protected the last remnants of the person she was meant to be. Her fight wasn't just for survival, it was a silent, daily battle to honor a legacy of decency in a world that rewarded cruelty. The atmosphere at Onyx was a sensory assault. The low ambient music was a carefully curated soundtrack for power plays, its soft notes weaving through the clinking of crystal and the hushed, predatory cadence of negotiations. Reflections of ornate chandeliers danced on polished surfaces, casting a golden, deceptive glow that hid the darkness in the room's corners. The air was thick with the scent of leather, expensive perfume, and rare cuisine, a combination that always made Claire feel like an intruder in her own workplace. She was surrounded by immense wealth and influence, yet she had never felt more isolated, a ghost haunting a feast she could never partake in. On this particular night, however, something felt different. A palpable tension hummed beneath the surface of the restaurant's controlled elegance. It wasn't just the usual arrogance of the clientele, it was something heavier, more watchful. Earlier, she had felt a gaze on her, steady and unnerving, from a table cloaked in the deepest shadows of the room. It was a corner that seemed to absorb all light, a void in the glittering expanse. She had tried to ignore it, dismissing it as paranoia, but the feeling lingered. The cold, prickling sensation of being observed, analyzed, and perhaps understood by someone who saw right through her invisible armor. A storm was gathering, and she was standing at its center. The late-night train was a metal serpent rattling through the city's dark veins. Claire sat with her head against the cool, vibrating glass, watching the blur of lights paint fleeting streaks across her reflection. The starched white uniform, once a symbol of her employment, was now a crumpled shroud tucked away in her tote bag, carrying the ghost of expensive wine and seared scallops. She was a ghost herself, moving between two worlds but belonging to neither. The exhaustion was more than physical. It was a deep, soul-level weariness that settled in her bones, a constant reminder of the chasm between the life she served and the one she was forced to live. She dreamed of a day when she wouldn't have to choose between fixing a leaking faucet and buying groceries, a simple freedom that felt as distant as the stars. This resilience was forged in the fire of an earlier loss, a profound injustice that had stolen her youth and left behind a hollow space in her heart. Her father, a man of unwavering principles, had been ruined by the very kind of powerful, careless men she now served every night. She carried his memory like a secret vow, a promise to never bend her own moral code, no matter the cost. This quiet grief fueled her empathy, but it also built a wall around her, a solitary fortress where she protected the last remnants of the person she was meant to be. Her fight wasn't just for survival, it was a silent, daily battle to honor a legacy of decency in a world that rewarded cruelty. The atmosphere at Onyx was a sensory assault. The low, ambient music was a carefully curated soundtrack for power plays, its soft notes weaving through the clinking of crystal and the hushed, predatory cadence of negotiations. Reflections of ornate chandeliers danced on polished surfaces, casting a golden, deceptive glow that hid the darkness in the room's corners. The air was thick with the scent of leather, expensive perfume, and rare cuisine, a combination that always made Claire feel like an intruder in her own workplace. She was surrounded by immense wealth and influence, yet she had never felt more isolated, a ghost haunting a feast she could never partake in. On this particular night, however, something felt different. A palpable tension hummed beneath the surface of the restaurant's controlled elegance. It wasn't just the usual arrogance of the clientele, it was something heavier, more watchful. Earlier, she had felt a gaze on her, steady and unnerving, from a table cloaked in the deepest shadows of the room. It was a corner that seemed to absorb all light, a void in the glittering expanse. She had tried to ignore it, dismissing it as paranoia, but the feeling lingered, the cold, prickling sensation of being observed, analyzed, and perhaps understood by someone who saw right through her invisible armor. Each screech of the subway wheels felt like a lament for the dream she had packed away with that uniform. Her apartment was her sanctuary and her cage. 4 flights of stairs led to a small space that smelled of old books and faint lemon cleaner. It was sparsely furnished, but every object held a story. A wilting succulent on the windowsill, a stack of worn paperbacks by her bed, a single framed photo of her parents smiling in a past that felt like another lifetime. On the small kitchen table, a neat pile of envelopes sat like a silent tribunal, their red-letter warnings a constant, humming anxiety. This was the tangible evidence of her struggle, the paper and ink manifestation of her mother's mounting medical debt and the student loans for a life she hadn't yet been allowed to claim. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was heavy with unspoken fears. Each week, she'd call her mother, forcing a brightness into her voice she hadn't felt in years. She'd paint a picture of a life that was stable, even promising, carefully omitting the double shifts, the ache in her feet, and the gnawing emptiness that followed her home. Her mother, frail but proud, would speak of recovery, of the day she'd be back on her feet, never knowing that her daughter's strength was the only thing holding their world together. These conversations were a tightrope walk of love and deception, each cheerful lie a small sacrifice Claire made to shield her mother from the harshness of their reality. Hanging up the phone always left her feeling hollow, the weight of her responsibilities pressing down with renewed force. The oppression at Onyx had a name, Mr. Sterling. The restaurant manager moved through the dining room with the predatory grace of a shark, his smile a thin, dismissive line. He thrived on the power he wielded over his staff, his compliments laced with condescension, his corrections delivered in sharp, humiliating whispers. Claire had learned to navigate his moods, to make herself small and efficient in his presence. She saw the way he favored waitresses who played into his ego and punished those, like her, who offered only quiet competence. He was a gatekeeper to her survival, a daily reminder that her dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford, always one complaint away from being revoked. Beneath her quiet compliance, however, a fire burned. It was the legacy of her father, an honest man who had lost everything to a business partner's greed. She remembered his weary eyes, the way his shoulders slumped after a lifetime of hard work was stolen by a man in a tailored suit. That memory was etched into her soul, a silent vow to never break her own moral code, to never become like the people she served. Her job was a constant battle between that vow and the necessity of survival. She poured wine for men who resembled her father's betrayer, her hand steady while her spirit raged in silence, dreaming not of wealth, but of simple, unwavering justice. New York was a city of exquisite cruelty. It promised everything and offered nothing, its glittering skyline a monument to a dream she could see but never touch. Walking home from the subway station, she felt the city's indifference in the cold wind that whipped through the canyons of brick and steel. She was surrounded by millions of people, yet the loneliness was an ache so profound it was almost physical. She was an anonymous face in a relentless tide of humanity, her private struggles invisible to the hurried, ambitious crowds. The city was a constant, roaring reminder of her own insignificance, a place that demanded everything from her while giving only just enough to keep her fighting. Just last week, she had watched as a young busboy, barely 18, was fired on the spot for accidentally dropping a tray of glasses. Mr. Sterling had made a public spectacle of it, his voice dripping with theatrical disappointment as he dismissed the tearful boy in front of the entire staff. Claire had felt a surge of protective fury, a desperate urge to speak up, but the fear of losing her own job had paralyzed her. The incident lingered, a sour taste in her mouth. It reinforced the brutal hierarchy of their world. The powerful were careless, the vulnerable paid the price, and justice was a concept that didn't exist within Onyx's marble walls. Tonight, the air in the restaurant felt particularly charged. A heavy, expectant energy pulsed beneath the veneer of calm sophistication. The senator's son and his entourage had been loud and demanding from the moment they arrived, their laughter sharp and laced with arrogance. Claire moved around their table with practiced caution, her senses on high alert. She refilled their water, cleared their plates, and endured their casual dismissiveness with the stoic poise she had perfected. Her entire being was focused on one goal: to remain invisible, to get through the night without incident, to collect her tips and retreat back to the safety of her quiet, lonely world. The catalyst was a moment of pure chaos. A different server, rushing from the kitchen, stumbled near the senator's son's table, jostling a nearby guest who in turn knocked over a full glass of red wine. It happened in a split second, a splash of crimson that seemed to bloom in slow motion against the pristine white of the man's suit jacket. Claire was 10 feet away, holding an empty tray, but his drunken, furious gaze landed on her. It was easier, she supposed, to blame the silent, unassuming waitress than to confront one of his own. His fingers shot out, trembling with rage, and the accusation, loud and venomous, shattered the restaurant's fragile peace. Mr. Sterling was at her side instantly, not to defend her, but to appease the powerful guest. His apology was immediate and fawning. He didn't ask what happened, he simply condemned her. His fingers closed around her arm, a grip that was both a punishment and a warning. He began to pull her, dragging her through the silent, watching tables, his voice a low, vicious hiss in her ear about her incompetence, her worthlessness. In that moment, all the unspoken humiliations, the silent struggles, and the crushing weight of her life coalesced into a single, searing point of shame. The eyes of the wealthy patrons were on her, cold and unforgiving, and she had never felt more alone. From the deepest, most secluded corner of the room, a shadow watched. It was a table that seemed to command its own pocket of silence, a place where the restaurant's golden light dared not intrude. Here Dante sat, a still point in a turning world, his presence a quiet weight that anchored the entire establishment. He had observed the entire scene unfold, not with curiosity, but with the detached analysis of a king serving his court. The senator's son's boorish display, the manager's craven appeasement, it was all a familiar, tedious theater of human weakness. He was a connoisseur of power, and what he was witnessing was its crudest, most pathetic form. His world was one of calculated violence and silent decrees, and this noisy, clumsy injustice was an offense to his sensibilities. He wore a suit of such a dark charcoal it seemed to absorb the light around him, tailored with a precision that bespoke immense wealth and discipline. His hands rested on the table, one on either side of a glass of untouched water, their stillness a stark contrast to the trembling rage of the accuser. Everything about him was controlled, from the severe line of his jaw to the unnerving calm in his dark, watchful eyes. He was a man who had stripped himself of all unnecessary movement, all wasted emotion. The air around him was different, colder, heavier, charged with an authority that needed no announcement. His two companions sat like stone sentinels, their loyalty absolute, their purpose singular. They did not speak or move, they simply existed as extensions of his will. His gaze, however, was fixed on her, on Claire. He saw past the uniform, the false accusation, the public humiliation. In the rigid set of her shoulders and the defiant tilt of her chin, he saw something he had long believed to be extinct, an unyielding, unbreakable dignity. She did not plead or cry, she simply endured, her eyes holding a deep, quiet sorrow that was not for herself, but for the ugliness of the world that was trying to break her. It was a purity that felt alien in this room, in this city, in his life. He saw the ghost of a man he once might have been, a reflection of an honor he had sacrificed long ago at the altar of power. She was a relic of a better world, and he felt a sudden, sharp, and unfamiliar urge to protect it. The final transgression was the manager's hand. The moment Mr. Sterling's fingers dug into her arm, something in Dante's icy composure fractured. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift, a slight narrowing of his eyes, a muscle feathering along his jaw. To an outside observer, he hadn't moved at all, but within him a decision had been made, swift and irrevocable. The touch was an invasion, a violation of a boundary he hadn't known existed until it was crossed. It was an act of casual cruelty against the one thing in the room that was genuine. The manager, in his pathetic attempt to assert his small dominion, had just trespassed on territory that now belonged to a far greater and far more dangerous power. He rose. The movement was not sudden or aggressive, but it carried the finality of a judge rising to deliver a verdict. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding of his large frame, a single, fluid motion that drew every eye in the restaurant. A wave of silence radiated out from his table, extinguishing conversations and freezing patrons mid-sip. The ambient music, once a sophisticated backdrop, now seemed intrusive and faded into nothingness. The senator's son's drunken tirade died in his throat. The manager's forward momentum ceased. The entire glittering room held its breath, its collective attention captured by the silent, imposing figure who now commanded the space with his mere presence. His path through the tables was direct and unhurried. He moved with the lethal grace of a panther, his polished shoes making no sound on the marble floor. He did not acknowledge the stunned faces that turned to watch him pass. His focus was a tangible force, a narrow, intense beam locked entirely on Claire. She felt his approach before she saw him, a sudden drop in temperature, a prickling on her skin as if a storm front was rolling in. When she finally looked up, she saw him cutting through the crowd, an island of profound stillness in a sea of shock. His eyes met her, and in their depths she saw not pity, but a dark, unsettling recognition that made her heart hammer against her ribs with a fear she couldn't name. When he reached them, he didn't speak. He simply placed a hand on Mr. Sterling's shoulder. The touch was light, almost casual, yet the manager froze as if he'd been struck by lightning. The color drained from his face, his grip on Claire's arm slackening instantly as a primal, instinctual terror overrode all other thoughts. Dante's hand was a conduit of absolute power, a silent communication of a threat so profound it needed no words. He applied no pressure, yet the manager was paralyzed, held captive by a force he could not comprehend, but knew, with chilling certainty, could extinguish him without a second thought. The opulent dining room had just become a different kind of territory, and they were all trespassers. Then he spoke. His voice was low, a rough, quiet timbre that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the room. It was not a shout, but it carried farther and with more weight than any scream. He looked directly at the manager, but his words were a proclamation to the world. "Nobody touches my woman." The statement hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. It was not a declaration of affection, it was a sentence. A claim of ownership, a drawing of a line in blood. For Claire, the words were a shockwave. She was no one's woman. Yet, in that single, terrifying moment, she felt the invisible circle of his power enclose her, a cage that was also, bewilderingly, a shield. The manager recoiled as if burned, stumbling back and stammering incoherent apologies. The senator's son, sobered by a fear greater than his entitlement, sank back into his chair, suddenly looking small and insignificant. Dante paid them no mind. His gaze remained on Claire, and for a fleeting second, the cold mask of his expression softened into something unreadable, not kindness, but a deep, resonant understanding. He saw the fighter in her, the survivor. With a slight, almost imperceptible nod, he gave her a silent instruction to leave. It was a dismissal and a command, an acknowledgement that her part in this public drama was over, though her role in his private one had just begun. She turned and walked away, her legs unsteady beneath her. She didn't look back, but she could feel his presence like a physical weight, a brand on her skin. The suffocating silence of the room was no longer about her humiliation. It was about the terrifying authority of the man who had intervened. The echo of his voice followed her, resonating in her mind not as a rescue, but as a binding contract she had never agreed to sign. She had walked into Onyx that evening as an invisible waitress, struggling to survive on the fringes of a world that didn't see her. She was leaving as something else entirely, claimed by a darkness far more profound than she could ever imagine. Her life was no longer her own. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and a constant humming anxiety. Claire didn't return to Onyx. She couldn't. The echo of Dante's voice, the weight of his claim, followed her everywhere, a ghostly presence in her small apartment. She expected a call from Mr. Sterling, a formal, gloating termination, but her phone remained silent. The absence of consequence was more terrifying than any punishment. It meant the power dynamic had shifted in a way she couldn't comprehend, leaving her adrift in a new, uncertain reality. His words, "Nobody touches my woman," were not a comfort. They were a brand, a declaration that had severed her from her old life and tethered her to a fate she had not chosen and could not control. His presence began as a whisper, a shadow at the edge of her perception.
A sleek black sedan, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness, was often parked across the street from her building. It was there in the early morning when she left to buy groceries, and there in the late afternoon when she returned, a silent, unmoving sentinel. She never saw the driver, but she felt the gaze. It was a constant, low-grade pressure on the back of her neck, a reminder that her solitude was now an illusion. He was watching over her, but it felt less like protection and more like surveillance, a quiet tightening of an invisible leash she could feel but never see. One afternoon, seeking refuge in the familiar quiet of a secondhand bookstore, she felt the atmosphere shift. The comfortable scent of aging paper and leather was suddenly charged with a new electric tension. She looked up from a book of poetry and saw him standing at the far end of the aisle, examining a heavy tome on Renaissance art. He wasn't looking at her, yet she knew he was aware of her every breath. When his gaze finally lifted and met her across the stacks of books, the world seemed to fall away. There was no threat in his eyes, only a still, profound recognition. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod before turning and leaving the store as silently as he had appeared. The encounter left her trembling, a war raging within her. Part of her was terrified. He was the embodiment of the violent, unaccountable power that had destroyed her father, a world of shadows and silent commands she had always despised. Yet another part of her, a part she was ashamed to acknowledge, couldn't forget the way he had looked at her. It wasn't the dismissive glance of the men she served at Onyx or the predatory stare of her manager. He saw the fight in her, the exhaustion, the pride. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly seen, and the man who saw her was a monster.
This contradiction was a splinter in her soul, a painful, fascinating puzzle. From the quiet luxury of his car, Dante watched her. He saw her exit the bookstore, clutching a thin volume of poems to her chest like a shield. He saw the defiant set of her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands. This woman, who possessed nothing the world valued, had more integrity in her smallest gesture than any man he had ever known. She was a relic of a world he had long ago burned to the ground within himself. He was drawn to her quiet strength, her unwavering moral clarity, like a moth to a flame that promised both warmth and annihilation. This pull was a dangerous vulnerability, a crack in the armor he had spent a lifetime forging, and yet he found himself utterly incapable of looking away. A week after the bookstore, a flat, unassuming package arrived at her door. There was no return address. Inside, cushioned in silk paper, was not a threat, but something far more insidious. It was a set of keys and a legal deed transferring ownership of a small, charming coffee shop in Greenwich Village into her name, free and clear. There was no note, no explanation, just the cold, official documents that represented a life she could only have dreamed of. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, who it was from. It wasn't a gift, it was a gilded cage, a silent, undeniable statement of his power over her destiny. Her first reaction was a surge of white-hot fury. This was not a kindness, it was an erasure of her struggle, her independence. He was trying to buy her compliance, to turn her into another one of his possessions, neatly packaged and paid for. The gesture was an insult to her father's memory, a violation of the very principles she lived by. She would not be bought, she would not be owned. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over into a desperate, reckless resolve. She had to confront him, to throw this gilded chain back in his face, even if it was the last thing she ever did. Her dignity was not for sale. Finding him was easier than she expected, as if he had left a trail for her to follow. An instinct she didn't know she possessed led her to a discreet, high-end hotel bar. A place of dark wood, low light, and whispered conversations. He was there, in a secluded booth, as if he had been waiting for her all along. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she walked forward, her steps steady. She placed the deed and the keys on the polished table between them. "I cannot accept this," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering,
each word a small stone of defiance against the mountain of his power. He looked from the documents to her face, his own expression an unreadable mask of calm. A long moment passed before he spoke, his voice a low, resonant timbre that seemed to absorb the sounds of the room. "It is not a gift for you to accept or refuse," he stated, his gaze holding hers with unnerving intensity. "It is a necessity. Your former manager has been permanently reassigned. The senator's son has been taught a painful lesson in public decorum. You made enemies that night who do not know my name, only yours. You are no longer safe in the world you knew." The words were a quiet, brutal truth, revealing a danger she hadn't even considered. His explanation was a cold splash of reality. He hadn't just shielded her from a moment of humiliation. He had shattered the brutal ecosystem of her life, inadvertently painting a target on her back. His protection had come at the cost of her anonymity, her safety. She felt a chill crawl up her spine as she began to understand the true complexity of her situation. This man, this purveyor of darkness, was operating by a code of his own, a violent, pragmatic logic that was both terrifying and, in its own twisted way, protective. She was beginning to see the man behind the myth, and he was far more dangerous and complicated than she had ever imagined. They sat in a silence that was heavier than any conversation. The clinking of ice in distant glasses and the soft murmur of other patrons faded into a dull hum. His eyes never left hers, and she felt as if he were performing a quiet autopsy on her soul, seeing every fear, every doubt, every flicker of defiance she possessed. She had come here to reject him, to reclaim her life, but she now understood that her life was no longer hers to reclaim. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken threats, unasked questions, and a strange, burgeoning connection that neither of them wanted, but both could feel taking root. As she finally rose to leave, her resolve shaken, her hand accidentally brushed against his where it rested on the table. The contact was fleeting, no more than a whisper of skin against skin, but it sent a bolt of pure electricity through her. A sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. His hand was cool, but the current that passed between them was searingly hot. They both froze, caught in a moment of unexpected, shocking intimacy. The carefully constructed walls between them, the vast chasm of power and morality, crumbled into dust in that single, breathless second of contact. In that brief, frozen moment, his mask of impenetrable control slipped. For a fraction of a second, she saw something raw and unguarded in his dark eyes, not the cold authority of a crime boss, but a profound, soul-deep loneliness.
It was a glimpse into a wound he had carried for a lifetime, a flash of the man he might have been before the darkness claimed him. The vulnerability vanished as quickly as it appeared, his expression locking back into its familiar, guarded stillness. But she had seen it, and that glimpse of the broken man within the monster was more terrifying than all his power combined. She snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned, her heart racing with a confusing mix of fear and an emotion she dared not name. She turned and walked out of the bar without another word, not daring to look back. The air outside felt cold against her heated skin. The line between her fear of him and her fascination with him had not just blurred, it had been completely erased. He was not a simple villain from a storybook. He was a man drowning in a darkness that, for one terrifying moment, had reached out and threatened to pull her in with him. The feeling of being watched changed over the next few days. It was no longer the silent, almost protective presence of his black sedan. This was different. It was predatory. Walking home from the subway one evening, she heard footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate, echoing in the quiet street. They matched her pace when she sped up, a cruel game of cat and mouse. This was the threat he had warned her about. The faceless enemies he had created for her were no longer a hypothetical danger. They were real, and they were closing in, the consequences of his world bleeding violently into hers. She took a shortcut down a narrow, poorly lit alley, a desperate gamble to lose her pursuer. It was a mistake. Two large figures emerged from the shadows ahead, blocking her path, while the man from behind closed off her escape. Their faces were cruel, their smiles devoid of warmth. "The senator's son sends his regards," one of them sneered, stepping forward. A cold, paralyzing fear gripped her, stealing the air from her lungs. This was it. This was the price of his intervention, a debt to be paid not by him, but by her. This was the brutal reality of his world. Just as a hand reached for her, the alley was flooded with blinding light. A black sedan screeched to a halt at the entrance, its engine a low, menacing growl. The doors opened and Dante emerged. He didn't move with the deliberate calm she'd seen before, but with a lethal, predatory grace that promised violence. His face, illuminated by the headlights, was a mask of glacial fury, his eyes burning with a cold fire that made the air itself seem to freeze. He had arrived not just to protect her honor, but to save her life from a danger he himself had brought upon her. Their worlds had finally, irrevocably fused in a crucible of imminent death. If you felt the tension in that alley, if your heart is still racing, then you know this story is just beginning. Like, share, and comment what you think he will do next. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to life. The alley became a vacuum, all sound and air sucked into the vortex of his presence. The thugs, moments ago confident predators, were now cornered animals, their sneers melting into a primal fear. Dante's rage was not a fire. It was an arctic cold, a stillness so absolute it was more terrifying than any scream. The headlights of his car carved him into a stark silhouette of judgment, his face a mask of controlled fury, his eyes promising a violence that was swift, personal, and final. He had broken his most sacred rule, never to act on emotion, never to intervene personally unless it was a matter of business. But this was not business. This was a desecration, and Claire was the sacred ground he had, without conscious thought, sworn to protect. He did not run. He walked forward, his steps measured and deliberate on the grimy pavement, each footfall a hammer blow against the thug's crumbling bravado. One of them, perhaps the leader, took an involuntary step back, a flicker of recognition, of dawning horror flashing in his eyes. He had not just accosted some random woman, he had trespassed against a ghost, a legend, whose name was only ever spoken in terrified whispers. The senator's son's petty revenge had just summoned a devil from the city's deepest shadows, and they were the insignificant souls who would pay the price. Dante's focus was singular, his entire being a weapon aimed at the men who had dared to lay a hand on what was his. It was not a fight, it was a dismantling. The first man's lunge was met with a brutal, efficient redirection of energy, ending with the sickening crack of a wrist shattering. A choked gasp was the only sound he made before collapsing. The second man, frozen in shock, was dispatched with a single, devastating blow to the throat that silenced him instantly, his eyes wide with a surprise that would never fade. The violence was precise, economical, and utterly devoid of passion. It was the work of a man for whom brutality was a language, a tool he wielded with the detached expertise of a master craftsman. In under 5 seconds, the threat was neutralized, the alley now home to two broken, moaning shapes on the ground. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the pained whimpers of the defeated men and the low, predatory hum of the car's engine. Dante stood over them for a moment, his breathing even, his dark suit impossibly undisturbed. He hadn't broken a sweat. He was a force of nature that had swept through, leaving wreckage in its wake without altering its own essential state. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, a small, chillingly normal gesture in a scene of savage violence. Then, slowly, as if emerging from a trance, he turned. The cold fury in his eyes was gone, replaced by something far more complex and unsettling as his gaze finally settled on Claire. She was pressed against the cold brick wall, her body trembling, but her eyes wide and lucid. She had just witnessed an act of terrifying brutality performed on her behalf, a demonstration of the lethal power that moved silently beneath the surface of his tailored suits and quiet commands. He saw it all in her gaze, the fear, the shock, but beneath it something else, a terrible, defiant light that refused to be extinguished. She was not looking at him as a savior. She was looking at him as a man who had just confirmed her deepest fears about his world, and in doing so, had chained her to it forever. Her silence was no longer that of a victim. It was the silence of a witness. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper of gratitude, but a fractured, challenging breath that cut through the charged air. Is this what it costs? The question was a transgression, a breaking of her own silent code of survival. She had never spoken back, never questioned, never challenged power. But he had not just saved her, he had implicated her. He had stained her with his darkness. The words hung between them, an accusation and a plea, a recognition that his protection was a cage built from the bones of other men. For the first time, she was not just an observer in her own life, she was demanding to know the rules of this terrifying new game. He closed the distance between them in 2 silent strides, stopping so close she could feel a heat radiating from his body. The scent of winter air and something uniquely his, something clean and dangerous, filled her senses. She expected anger, a cold dismissal. Instead, he slowly lifted a hand, not to strike or restrain her, but with a strange, hesitant reverence. His fingers, impossibly gentle, brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his thumb coming to rest for a heartbeat against the frantic pulse in her throat. The contact was an electric shock, a point of searing warmth in the cold, terrifying night. It was an act of such profound, unexpected intimacy, it stole the breath from her lungs. In that single, suspended heartbeat, as his thumb rested against her skin, their eyes locked, and the world fell away. She saw it then, behind the killer's gaze, a desolate, profound loneliness. She saw the boy who had been forced to become a king, the man who had built a fortress of power and fear around a heart that had been broken long ago. And he, in turn, saw not just her innocence, but a mirror. He saw the honor he had sacrificed, the light he had extinguished within himself. He saw her fear, not just of him, but for him. It was a silent, devastating confession, a shared glimpse into the wreckage of their souls. He pulled his hand back as if the contact had scorched him. The spell shattered, and the brutal reality of the alley crashed back in on them. He had just exposed a part of himself he had kept buried for decades. She had just touched the humanity of a monster. An invisible chasm had opened and closed between them, and now they stood on opposite sides of a line that had been crossed in both directions. He had broken his code for her, and she, in turn, had broken through his defenses. The violence in the alley was nothing compared to the silent, emotional violence of that single revelatory moment. They stood in the wreckage, the sounds of the city a distant, muffled roar. The headlights of the idling car cut a stark, theatrical stage in the darkness, illuminating the two of them in a tableau of shared transgression. He was the Dark King, and she was the captive who had just seen his crown was made of thorns. Nothing needed to be said. The act of violence was a statement, but the moment of connection was a verdict. They were no longer a powerful man and a vulnerable woman. They were 2 souls caught in the same inescapable gravity. The silence that followed was not an absence of sound, but a vow neither had intended to make. The drive back to her apartment was a journey through a vacuum. The roaring violence of the alley had been replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure, pressing in on Claire from all sides. Dante drove with a focused, almost frightening stillness, his hands steady on the wheel, his profile carved from stone against the fleeting city lights. He did not look at her, did not speak. The air in the car was thick with the unspoken, with the ghost of his touch and the memory of the brutal efficiency of his hands. When he pulled up to her building, the engine's low hum was the only sound.
He simply stopped, his gaze fixed forward, a silent, absolute dismissal. The chasm between their worlds had never felt wider or more real than in that suffocating, shared silence. Once inside, she locked and bolted her door, leaning against it as her legs finally gave way. The small apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a stage where the final act of her old life had just concluded. The scent of violence seemed to cling to her, a phantom smell of blood and fear that her own familiar world could not erase.
She stood in the dark, her body still trembling with the aftershocks of what she had witnessed. His protection was not a shield, it was a brand, an invisible mark that had seared itself onto her soul. The memory of his thumb against her throat was a point of heat in the cold terror, a confusing, intimate anchor in a storm of brutality. She was safe, but she had never felt more captive. Miles away, in a penthouse that was less a home than a sterile observation deck above the city, Dante stood before a wall of glass. The sprawling metropolis below was a glittering, indifferent tapestry, a kingdom he commanded with cold precision. He poured a measure of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass, but did not drink it. The woman, Claire, was a flaw in his meticulously constructed world, a variable he could not control. The feeling of her pulse beneath his thumb was a ghost on his skin, a reminder of a vulnerability he had spent his life eradicating. Protecting her had required him to become the very thing he kept hidden from the world, and in her eyes he had seen not gratitude, but a terrifying, lucid reflection of his own monstrousness. For her to be safe, he had to disappear from her life completely. The first sign was the absence. The black sedan that had been a silent fixture on her street was gone. The feeling of being watched vanished, and the sudden lack of it was not liberating, but unnerving, like the silence that follows a storm. The city felt vast and empty, its indifference once again a cold, sharp reality. She was alone, truly alone, in a way she had not been before. His presence had been a low, constant hum beneath the surface of her days, a source of both fear and a strange, unacknowledged security. Now there was only a profound void, an emptiness that echoed with the memory of his power and the chilling finality of his departure. He had erased himself from her world as cleanly and efficiently as he had erased the men in the alley. Rain began to fall, tracing sad, blurry paths down her window pane, turning the city lights into a watercolor of melancholy. She sat in the dark, the keys to the coffee shop resting on the small table beside her, their metal cool and heavy in her palm. They were a relic of a life that was never hers, a promise of a future that had been offered and then violently rescinded. The clock on the wall ticked with a slow, merciless rhythm, each second marking the growing distance between that moment in the alley and the silent, empty present. The city outside wept, and its sorrow felt like her own, a shared lament for a connection that was too dangerous to exist, yet too powerful to be forgotten. The terror she had felt in the alley began to slowly recede, replaced by a painful, piercing lucidity. She replayed the scene in her mind, not the violence, but the moment his eyes had met hers. She saw past the killer and recognized the profound isolation of the man. His brutality was not born of malice, but of a lifetime spent in a cage of his own making, a world where such acts were the only language of protection. Her fear of him began to transform into a deeper, more complex emotion, a sorrowful empathy for the man trapped inside the monster. This shift was a quiet, internal earthquake, a maturing of her soul as her pain sharpened into a devastatingly clear understanding. She had not just been a victim of his world, she had become its sole witness. Dante, meanwhile, retreated into the familiar rituals of his darkness. He moved through his empire like a ghost, his face an unreadable mask of control. He chaired meetings where men twice his age trembled at his silence,
made decisions that could build or shatter fortunes, and immersed himself in the cold, hard logic of power. But in the quiet moments, in the reflection of a polished boardroom table or the window of his car, he would see her face. She saw the defiant terror in her eyes, the unwavering light of her spirit that he had almost extinguished by pulling her into his orbit. Each memory was a form of self-flagellation, a reminder of the code he had broken and the purity he had tainted with his presence. He was a king returning to his exile. A month after the alley, a sterile, official-looking envelope arrived, containing a single document. It was a receipt, stamped and finalized, confirming that her mother's entire medical debt had been paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. There was no note, no message, just the cold, undeniable proof of his final act. It was a transaction, not a gift. It was his way of severing the final thread, of settling an account he felt he owed. The gesture was meant to free her, to give her back the life he had disrupted, but it felt like a gravestone, a final, impersonal marker on something that had been intensely, terrifyingly alive. The relief was drowned by a wave of profound and absolute loss. She held the paper, the ink a stark black against the white, and a quiet resolve settled over her. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel. He had tried to give her back her old life, but that life no longer existed. He had shown her a world of shadows, and in doing so, had inadvertently shown her her own strength. She would not be a ghost haunting the edges of his memory. She would take the freedom he had given her, this brutal, blood-soaked gift, and build something new from the ashes.
She would honor her father's memory not by hiding, but by living with the same quiet, unbreakable dignity she had refused to surrender, even in the darkest alley. They were two solitary figures in a city of millions, separated by a chasm of morality and circumstance. He stood in his glass tower, a king surveying a silent kingdom, forever haunted by the one subject he had been forced to set free. She stood by her small window, looking out at the same rain-swept city, no longer a victim, but a survivor who had looked into the abyss and found her own light. The distance between them was absolute, the silence complete. But in that silence, an echo remained, the unspoken truth of a shared moment when a monster and a waitress saw the broken humanity in each other's eyes. A year passed, a quiet turning of seasons that slowly healed the raw edges of her memory. Claire was no longer a ghost in a gilded world. She was the architect of her own. She had taken the keys, that blood-soaked gift, and transformed the small Greenwich Village space into a haven of light and warmth. She named it the Alibi, a private, defiant joke. The air inside smelled of freshly ground coffee, old books, and cinnamon, a world away from the cold perfume and metallic scent of power that had once defined her life. Here, surrounded by the gentle murmur of conversation and the clink of ceramic on wood, she had found a peace she once believed was impossible. She was not just surviving, she was finally, quietly living. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, the kind of day when rain fell in a steady, melancholic rhythm against the large front window of the cafe. The steady outside was a blur of gray and rushing umbrellas. Claire was wiping down the counter, the familiar, comforting motions a form of meditation, when a shape outside caught her eye. A black sedan, sleek and silent as a panther, had pulled to a stop across the street. It was a model of car she had not seen in a year, yet its presence was as familiar as a scar. Her heart did not pound with fear as it once would have. Instead, a slow, heavy beat began, a deep and resonant drum of recognition. He was here. She moved to the window, her reflection a faint superimposition over the rain-streaked street. She could not see him clearly through the tinted glass, but she did not need to. She felt his gaze, a tangible weight that crossed the distance and the downpour. It was not the possessive, assessing look she remembered from Onyx, nor the cold fury from the alley. This was something else entirely, the quiet, distant regard of a watchman, a ghost keeping vigil over a life he could never be a part of. He had not come to reclaim her or to interfere. He had come simply to witness, to see that the light he had fought to protect from his own darkness was still burning. Their eyes met through the rain-spattered glass, a brief, impossible connection across an unbridgeable divide. An entire story passed between them in that silent, suspended moment. He saw her, not as the frightened waitress, but as the woman who had taken the fractured pieces of her life and built a sanctuary. And she saw him, not as a monster or a savior, but as a solitary king, forever imprisoned in the cold, silent fortress of his own making. There was no judgment, no longing, only a profound, sorrowful acceptance of their separate fates. It was a shared look of absolution, a final, unspoken acknowledgement that they had irrevocably and beautifully saved each other. A slow, almost imperceptible nod was his only movement. It was a final gesture of respect, a farewell, a release. Then the car pulled away from the curb, its red taillights bleeding into the gray afternoon before disappearing into the flow of traffic. He was gone. Claire remained at the window for a long moment, watching the space where he had been. She did not feel loss, but a quiet, aching sense of completion. She turned back to the warmth and light of her cafe, her life, her future. Some bonds were not forged in touch, but in the silence, unbridgeable distance between two worlds. They were two souls who brushed against each other in the dark, forever altered by the brief, searing light of their connection. His redemption was in his absence, hers was in the life she built from the ashes. If their silent goodbye resonated with you, if you believe that even in the deepest shadows a flicker of humanity can survive, then let us know. Like this story, share it with someone who understands the weight of unspoken words, and comment below on what you believe true redemption really means. Subscribe for more journeys that explore the heart of the shadow and the light it can never quite extinguish.